Hey, welcome to our explainer. Today, we're digging into a piece of American Civil War history that you probably never learned in school. It's a story about a horrific massacre that, believe it or not, directly led to the famous promise of 40 acres and a mule. Okay, let's set the scene. The date is December 9th, 1864. We're at a place called Ebenezer Creek in Georgia. And everything, I mean everything, in the story comes down to one single fateful decision made right here by a Union general. So, to really get what happened and why it's so important, we need to zoom out a bit. You've got to understand the bigger picture of what was going on. This all takes place during General William T. Sherman's legendary and incredibly destructive March to the Sea. So, as Sherman's army is tearing across Georgia, it becomes this beacon of freedom. And naturally, thousands of African Americans who had just escaped slavery start following the Union soldiers. But for the army commanders, this huge, growing group of people was becoming a massive logistical headache. It strained their supplies and slowed them down. Now, just look at how fast this all went down. On December 8th, the Union's 14th Corps gets to this swollen creek and they build a bridge. By the very next morning, all 14,000 soldiers are safely across. But, and this is the crucial part, the second that last soldier is on the other side, their general gives an absolutely shocking order: pull up the bridge. This was no accident. It was a conscious decision to abandon hundreds of refugee families, leaving them trapped as Confederate cavalry closed in. What happened next was just pure horror. You have to imagine the panic. With Confederate soldiers bearing down on them, people were desperate. Many threw themselves into the freezing cold creek, trying to swim across. Most of them drowned. And those who were left behind? They were either killed or dragged right back into slavery. So you've got to ask yourself, who on earth would give an order like that? Why would a Union general, someone who was supposed to be a liberator, do something so unbelievably cruel to the very people his army was there to free? Well, the man responsible was Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis. And nope, no relation to the Confederate president, just a really unfortunate coincidence. Now, Davis was known as a pretty competent commander on the battlefield, but he saw the thousands of people seeking freedom not as human beings to be protected, but as a logistical burden. He tried to defend his actions, calling it a military necessity, but his own men, his own officers, told a very different story. They said he was openly and aggressively hostile towards African Americans. And that, right there, is the heart of it. This wasn't just some cold, calculated military move. His decision was fueled by his own personal racist beliefs. He was known to be a supporter of slavery. So to him, these men, women, and children weren't allies. They were just an obstacle to be removed. Now you might be thinking an act this cruel has to be a one-off, a terrible stain on an otherwise normal career. But when it comes to General Davis, his capacity for violence, well, the story gets even more disturbing. Get this, just 2 years before Ebenezer Creek, Davis gets into an argument with his superior officer, a guy named General Bull Nelson. Nelson publicly insults him and slaps him in the face. Davis's response: he doesn't challenge him to a duel, he doesn't report him. He calmly walks away, borrows a pistol, comes right back, and shoots the unarmed general dead right there in the hotel lobby. And the craziest part, he got away with it, completely. The Union Army was so short on experienced commanders that they basically just swept the murder under the rug. So think about what that means. This set a terrifying precedent. Jefferson C. Davis was a man who knew he could commit murder and face absolutely no consequences. But here's where this terrible story takes a totally unexpected turn. As awful as this massacre was, the outrage it created actually started a chain reaction that led to one of the most radical and famous promises in American history. So when word of what Davis did at the creek finally reached the newspapers up north, people were horrified. The public outcry was so loud and so intense that it forced General Sherman and even President Lincoln's administration to do something about this atrocity. And that something was Special Field Orders Number 15. Facing immense pressure, General Sherman actually sat down and met with Black community leaders in Savannah. And the result was this revolutionary order. It was basically the first ever attempt at government-led reparations in U.S. history, seizing land from Confederate slaveholders to give to the very people they had enslaved. And the scale of this was just massive. We're talking 400,000 acres of prime coastal land across South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. This wasn't just some symbolic gesture. It was a real, tangible plan for economic freedom. It was a foundation for a new life. And yep, this right here is the origin story. This is where 40 acres and a mule comes from. The order specifically said the land would be divided into 40-acre plots. Now, the mule part actually came a bit later. The army would sometimes give surplus mules to families to help them get started. So this incredible promise was born directly from the ashes of that massacre. But as you've probably already guessed, this groundbreaking promise, a promise that came directly out of a war crime, was not built to last. See, the order had a fatal flaw from the very beginning. It was a temporary military order, not a permanent law passed by Congress. That means its legal foundation was shaky, really only designed to be in effect for the duration of the war. And that temporary status proved to be its doom. After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his successor, Andrew Johnson, who was way more sympathetic to the old Southern plantation owners, revoked the order. Just like that, the land was taken away from the thousands of freed families who had begun building new lives, and was given a right back to the very Confederates who had fought a war to keep them enslaved. Okay, so this brings us to one last really important question. An event this big, this dramatic, a massacre by a Union general that leads directly to the 40 acres and a mule promise. Why have so few of us ever even heard the name Ebenezer Creek? Well, the reasons are pretty complicated. For one, it messes with the simple, clean narrative of the Civil War. You know, the Union are the good guys, Confederates are the bad guys story. It shows that even the saviors could commit terrible atrocities. It also doesn't fit with the lost cause narrative that tried to whitewash the Confederacy after the war. And of course, it's just plain uncomfortable. And today, the question of whether or not to teach a story like this falls right into the middle of our huge, ongoing debates about education. On one side, you have people saying we have to teach the full, messy, complicated story of our past to understand our present. And on the other side, you have people who worry that focusing on these divisive topics will just make students feel guilty or ashamed. I mean, think about this for a second. It took until the year 2010, almost 150 years after it happened, for a simple historical marker to be put up at the site of the massacre. For more than a century, the ground itself held no official memory of the horror that took place there. And that really leaves us with one final thing to think about. The story of Ebenezer Creek connects a war crime to a broken promise, all the way to a modern debate about what we choose to remember. So the question it leaves us with is this: what else have we forgotten? And more importantly, what's the cost of that forgetting?